So can we still hear each other, Claire?
I can hear you, Chris, absolutely loud and clear. What about you?
Yeah, I can hear you too. Oh,
here we go. Good evening, everyone. My name's Clare Wright, and on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, I'd like to welcome you to the library's author event tonight. It's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Chris Flynn this evening to discuss his wonderful new book, Mammoth. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which I presently am enjoying occupancy, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation of what is now named Melbourne, and to acknowledge that their land was stolen and that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge that Chris is coming to you from Bunurong land on what's now known as Phillip Island. And finally, I'll acknowledge that the Wattarong people and the East Maar original owners of the lands on which the Geelong Regional Library Corporation operates its services. I'd like to pay my respects to all of these elders, past and present. And if you're wondering why I haven't said emerging, I'd like to steer you towards the essay in a recent edition of the Monthly by Professor Megan Davis, which is called Reconciliation and the Promise of an Australian Homecoming. The land we are all on now, the land on which we live and work and eat and sleep, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. A few housekeeping issues before we get started in our conversation with Chris tonight. You can participate in this live webinar by clicking on the Q&A button and typing your question or comment. And you may need to touch your screen to see the Q&A and the chat function if you're using an iPad or an iPhone, but I reckon you've probably figured that out by now. I'll also let you know that this webinar is being recorded. And if you'd like to watch this discussion again, or if you'd like to recommend it to family or to friends, you can watch it via the library's website, and it should be available by this weekend. So tonight I have the great pleasure of introducing my old mate Chris Flynn to discuss his book Mammoth, which tells the story of how, and I'm going to read this because just wait for it, it tells the story of how the skull of a Tyrannosaurus bataar, the fossilized bones of a dire wolf, a pterodactyl, a prehistoric penguin, the severed hand of an Egyptian mummy, and a 13,000-year-old extinct American mastodon came to be on sale at a natural history auction in New York in 2007. Welcome, Chris.
hello, Claire. You make it sound so weird.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to tell you right from the start. I loved your novel. In fact, I'd be holding it up and waving it around now, but I pressed it into a friend's hands as soon as I finished reading it. And then Melbourne went into lockdown and I haven't been able to get it back since. So thank you for show and tell there. I loved your novel, but I have to admit, it was one of the weirdest and funniest books I've ever read. Okay, so when my husband asked me what I was reading when I was in bed chuckling away, I described it as a mixture between National Geographic, a Pixar movie, and a George Saunders novel. So what I want you to do is walk me through that day when you went into the office of your editor or your publisher and pitched this idea to them.
That's a pretty accurate description. I think you've sort of described it better than anyone else has so far. Yeah, the pitch. I spent years researching and writing the book, 6 years all up, and it was one of those projects that, you know how sometimes you get an idea and you embark on it and you think, what am I doing? I've no idea whether I'm even working on a book here, but it's sort of a fun historical research project for me, and not really knowing where it was all leading. And when I finally did manage to whip it all together into the shape of some kind of strange novel, I then had, I'd spent years on it by that stage. And then I thought, well, that seems like a fun project, but how on earth do I proceed from this point? There's not a publisher in the land who's going to want to borrow this. It's not really like anything else, and that's, you know, said in as modestly as I can. It seems like a humorous novel, but it also seems like a non-fiction, you know, exploration of very specific times in human history. So when we started, my agent and I, when we started pitching it to publishers, we were kind of just, you know, throwing it into the wind. I had no idea how people would react to it. I just assumed everyone would say, what a load of rubbish. This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. And to my surprise, pretty much all the publishers we sent it to were really keen on it. And UQP in particular were instantly enthusiastic for it. And
that's because it's really good.
Right. Well, okay. Thank you. But but it's still, it doesn't matter how good it is. In the publishing world, which is a very conservative world, very risk averse, you know, any kind of thing that steps outside the boundaries is always going to maybe struggle, you'd assume, to find a home. But maybe it just came along at the right time, and there's a bit of an appetite perhaps for different kinds of books, different kinds of narratives. You know, you could argue that, I mean, it's probably going to get me in trouble by saying it, but you could argue that Australian fiction has maybe been in a bit of a rut for a few years, and a lot of very similar kind of books coming out. So maybe it just appealed because it was just different from anything else that they were receiving at the time. And I have to give credit to Aviva Tuffield at UQP. She was all over it instantly, super enthusiastic for it. And so that was a total surprise to me that someone else could share my enthusiasm for this odd little world that I created. And that surprise has continued as the book has come out, because there are more and more people joining the ranks of fans of Mammoth and his journey. And so it's all gravy to me. I didn't expect anyone to ever read it. So the fact that anyone is amazing to me.
Chris, though Mammoth is a feat of soaring imagination, as you've suggested, it's grounded in research. And I'm an historian myself, and I'm a complete research nerd. So I'm going to ask you the question that I want to ask you. I want to know, how did you go about your research? Where did you do your research? Was it archival? Were you mostly reading books? I mean, you know, it's so deeply grounded in an evidence base.
Research is kind of fun to do these days, I reckon, because you can resort to a lot of different sources. What I tended to do was, when I knew I had to write about a certain month in 1800, because the narrative was set in, say, you know, December 1800. So I think, okay, this is where I am at the moment in the book. So what happened that month? And there's loads of fun to be had there, because there's the obvious, you know, grand historical events that you can easily find out about on the internet. But then you start to go into down these rabbit holes where you are clicking through and clicking through and clicking through and getting more and more obscure websites, to the point where you exhaust the internet, because the internet seems like the sum of all human knowledge in this vast resource. But in many ways, particularly with history, I find it to be quite limited. You very quickly come up against a dead end and references to primary sources, which are often books, archives that are maybe not there. So I would have fun going down these winding paths until I could go no further, and then I would say, "Oh, I've come across this this character, a real person who existed at that time. I can only find out so much about them on the internet. So now I have to find out. I have to source books." And so I would go on to some pretty obscure bookstore and find, often out of print, often university press from all around the world books, and written by academics who probably no one had read the books for years, and I would buy them. And so there was constant stream of odd little university press books arriving in the mail, which I would then read and enjoy and find pleasure in, and make loads of notes. I'm one of those terrible people who writes all over my research books, so I would buy some out of print book and then sort of pretty much destroy it by writing all over it. And then make my notes from that, and occasionally that would send me somewhere else again. So there's just this I really loved doing the research for the book, especially since I didn't really know why I was doing it. And I knew there was a story there, but it took me a long time to be able to work out what the story was and how it would be structured. But I didn't worry about it too much. I just enjoyed diving into the obscurity of history, which I'm sure you've done many times yourself. And as you know, when you're looking at the lives of ordinary people, it can be quite difficult to find out, what their lives were like, how they felt about things, what their fears were. And that's a huge challenge, I think, for any historian and any researcher, is going past the lives of the wealthy and the famous and the exalted, and just finding out, what life was like for ordinary people.
Let alone 13,000-year-old extinct mastodons. But we'll get to that. getting into the head of your main character. So one of the things that's quite inspiring about what you're saying is that it sounds like the majority of the research for this book, which is interestingly, particularly in terms of Australian fiction, is not set in Australia. You have a few throwaway lines about Australia. It becomes a kind of piss take. But the book is set in the United States and in France and in Ireland. But it sounds like you undertook the majority of the research from right there at your desk in Phillip Island. Did you actually get on any planes pre-COVID? And
well, yes and no is the answer, because I had the idea in my head for a long time before I even started seriously working on it. And Ireland and France feature because I am Irish, and I lived in France for a few years. And it's fun that we're doing this for Geelong Regional Libraries tonight, because libraries have always been somewhere that have saved me really as a person. Ever since I was a child. My parents are illiterate, and I had a very cursory education in Ireland, and but the library was the place that I went to learn how to be a person. And the librarians in my hometown, it's a small village outside of Belfast, they educated me, took me under their wing, and would show me into the history section at a very young age and into the adult fiction section, recommend books to me, allowed me to explore my interests and helped me with that. And they were just young women at the time when I was a child, and they're still there. So that's a little sort of secret resource I have in my back pocket. So sometimes I can email them and ask them to look something up for me. So if I'm in it, and there's some great libraries in Ireland, like the Linen Hall Library in Belfast, that is a fabulous place. And does it feature in the book? I think I was tempted to put it in there, but I didn't in the end. So I do have still a connection to libraries and and archives in Ireland. Not so much France anymore. My connections from France have sort of fallen away. But if COVID wasn't around, it would have been an indulgent pleasure to go off and explore libraries in France and Ireland for this.
I think all of us researchers are going to be seeing international travel as a indulgence. And it sounds from what you're saying that you're like a kind of dude version of Matilda from Roald Dahl's book. And I really like thinking of you like that. I've got to say that my parents are highly literate and I grew up in a house full of books, but I was saved by libraries as well, just basically being a weird, lonely nerd.
Hmm.
And that's the place that I've always found a sanctuary in that way as well. So shout out to all the librarians out there. And they are a wonderful resource. Chris, most of the action of the book takes place in the first decade of the 19th century. So we've got Jefferson as the President of the United States, and there's an Irish Republican rebellion happening. France is going berserk under Napoleon, including buying up chunks of America, where the Western plains are being ruthlessly exploited by white fellas. For some reason, at this point in history, none of this felt like ancient human history. What taught you more about American exceptionalism and triumphalism? Researching the archives or just monitoring the daily news?
They were very linked, I have to admit. And what's happening in America, in contemporary America, resonated a lot with me whenever I was working out how to do this book. And it was essentially the links between present day America and America at the start of the 19th century that made me realize that there was a story here that could be told. That by talking about what happened in 1800 after Jefferson was elected, and the subsequent years and that period of history when, you know, men of science and men of religion were the same men, and there was a lot of people were trying to work out how old the earth was. They didn't really know. They were constantly reevaluating what they knew. There was a lot of tumult, a lot of revolution was being fomented everywhere. And this idea of democracy was very sort of fresh and new and very raw and still very violent. And then you look at what's happening today and it seems like they're about to go through exactly the same thing all over again. It's almost like they're on the cusp of another civil war and fought for the same reasons, to free themselves from tyranny and for the rights of people of color. You know, it's just bizarre how history will repeat itself, but that's kind of one of the things that the book's about. And you know, to link back to Jefferson, when he was elected in 1800, the 1800 presidential election, back then when the elections took place, I mean, we're probably going to see an echo of that this year, to be honest. The election took place, I think started in November, and it took a long time for them for the votes to be cast. It's not like they didn't have a modern system, obviously. So it took, you know, about a month for the votes to be cast. And then it took another few months for them to count them. So a week after the election was over in December 1800, Jefferson was sitting around twiddling his thumbs, waiting to find out if he'd won. But he didn't know until February the following year. And we might see something similar this year. But in the meantime, he was writing letters to pioneers asking them to go out and look for mammoth bones in the wild. He was a keen amateur paleontologist and was fascinated with these huge creatures that once apparently roamed the American plains, that might even have been still out there, he thought. You jump forward 200 years and to the night of the auction in 2007, which was a real auction when all of these fossils were on sale. And they were fought over by wealthy men yet again. So Hollywood actors like Nicolas Cage and Leonardo DiCaprio squabbled over the skull of the Tyrannosaurus bataar, and Nicolas Cage ended up buying it for $276,000, and he basically, these men were snatching them out from under the watchful eyes of natural history museums who, you know, wanted to use them for educational purposes, just to hang on their wall and act like big powerful men. So that struck a chord with me, that idea that the same thing had been happening for the past 200 years, that we were still, Americans in particular, were still commodifying these bones for sort of very patriarchal, macho purposes, and that hasn't really changed very much. And there are references to our current American president. In the book, there's, I don't know if everyone got it, but there's a nice little reference where the Tyrannosaurus is being asked about how tiny his hands are. And his response is actually lifted verbatim from something that Trump said whenever someone pointed out his tiny hands.
I got that one. Well, it's one of the incredible structures of the book is that you jump between the fossils in the museum about to go for auction in contemporary times, told in very contemporary language. This is where it sounds like a Pixar movie. You know, it's these wisecracking guys and one old mummy who are, you know, just shooting the shit and chewing the fat, and it's told in very laconic and droll humor. And then you've got the second structure, which is actually the narrative being played out in the early 19th century. I'm really struck, as I said before, by the fact that the book is laugh out funny. And they're really, I've got to say, there's very few novels that are laugh out funny. And that's a great credit to you. But despite the humor, there's this very serious message about the arrogance of humans that's embedded in the narrative. Tell me a bit more about what do you want us to understand about humans by making the bones of extinct animals the central cast of this story?
The bones are essentially a useful way to observe human behavior over a long period of time. And, you know, the more I looked at it, and going right back to the end of the Ice Age, when the mammoth is describing what happened to him and how he died, I wanted to show that there are parallels to human behavior ever since we basically arrived and started making tools and building huts and, you know, getting a bit full of ourselves. We've been making the same mistakes ever since then. And, you know, when early man arrived on the steppe, you know, at the end of the Ice Age, that's why the Ice Age ended, because of us. We turned up and slaughtered everything that we saw, all the animals, millions of creatures that roamed the steppe, who were doing a job there, who were keeping the ground, you know, cold and hard. We killed all of them. We burnt everything. And then all the ice melted and the earth started to warm up. And it's the real origin of human influenced climate change. And you jump forward 13,000 years and we're doing pretty much the same thing. We're still slaughtering animals wholesale, not taking care of them, burning everything, setting fire to everything. And the place is getting warmer and warmer and warmer all the time. And we never really seem to learn. And so the animals were a useful way to basically not chastise humanity, but to just illustrate how our progress that we feel like we've made in the last 10,000 years perhaps is not as advanced as we might think. And that I mean, as you know yourself, history is in a way, you know, absolutely invaluable to us. But we never really pay attention to it as much as we should. We will constantly say, and you're constantly probably telling people about things that happened in the past that we should be learning from. But do we learn from them? I don't know that we do. And one of the things I wanted to say with this book was the fact that we are arrogant, we are fairly stupid and ignorant, and don't listen to what's the messages that the natural world are desperately trying to convey to us. And we are almost we are part of the natural world, but we like to exclude ourselves from it and think that we're above it, that we're lords of the natural kingdom, and that animals are just dumb creatures and we can't understand them. But we just don't want to listen to them, and we don't want to think of them in terms of them being intelligent creatures who might have memory, who might have emotions, who might love and fear. That doesn't suit us to think of them like that. And so the animals here, the fossils, even though they're dead, they've been around, their consciousness has been around ever since they died. And I like the idea of them just quietly observing us and shaking their heads and being able to point out the fact that they can see the same behaviors being repeated again and again. And they're wondering when we're going to notice that ourselves.
So yeah, the animals who are the bones are completely sentient, and they definitely have a perspective on humans that we might not want to have ourselves, as you suggest. But I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment. Isn't extinction just a natural part of evolution? Isn't it why other species of hominids, apart from Homo sapiens, didn't survive? Is it possible that we just haven't lived long enough for another species of humans to evolve?
That is entirely possible, but I think we will probably interfere too much before that ever happens. I think we're at the stage now where we will very soon be controlling evolution, if we're not already. One of the things I looked at a little bit in the book and have been studying a lot since is cloning and synthetic biology and the advances in science that we're making. I mean, it's talked about at the end of the book that, and it is true, there are areas of Siberia that have been set aside and rewilded for to restore help restore the permafrost by reintroducing extinct species, and we will very shortly be able to do that. However, the technology for cloning is advancing at such an alarming rate that we will very soon potentially be able to change ourselves and be masters, if you like, of our own evolution. So I think the next stage of human evolution will not be a natural one. It will be one where we have interfered yet again, and probably without thinking about the deep consequences in it. They're very close to bringing the mammoth back to life. There's 3 different teams around the world working on that, one in Harvard, one in South Korea, and one in Shenzhen. And they've got viable DNA from a mammoth carcass that thawed out in 2006. And so they will bring them back. And other species too, talking about bringing back the passenger pigeon and the dodo and the Tasmanian tiger, and just about anything that they can get the DNA for. And you can already get your dogs cloned in South Korea. So if you see Barbara Streisand, if you see a photo of Barbara Streisand on the internet with her 2 puppies, Miss Violet and Miss Scarlet, those are clones of her previous dog. She paid $100,000 and got her previous dog that's now dead cloned. And so she's got 2 clone puppies. And it doesn't take much imagination to make the leap into humanity. And whether we think it's ethical or not, or the right thing to do or not, someone will do it. And that's scary, because that's essentially time travel, because you could be cloned, Claire, and then you can have a clone baby of you delivered to you, and you can help raise that baby, and that's you. And then that baby will continue after you're dead, so a version of you will go on.
All right, while I just wrap my head around that one, one of the advantages that humans have, whether it's apart from the advantage of technology, is that they can write their own story. The woolly mammoth couldn't write his or her own story, but you've done it for him. Chris, they say that all novels are in some way autobiographical. So I'm wondering how easy or otherwise it was to think yourself into the headspace of a 13,000-year-old extinct American mastodon. How much is Mammoth, Chris?
Very little, actually. Kind of an odd thing happened with regards to that. It's not so much me putting myself into his headspace as him putting himself into mine. And I know that sounds a bit woo-woo, but
sorry, we've just cloned me several times over. We've gone to woo-woo.
That's okay. Yeah, I kind of subscribe to that Liz Gilbert view about characters and stories being animist and sort of existing outside of us, and you know, you become interested in something, you're researching it, and meanwhile the story is just waiting for you to finish that research so it can get started. And it did feel a little bit like with the Mammoth. I had no idea how I was going to write that voice. I was very frightened about the actual commencement of the writing process after doing all this research, because as you know, you're doing research and that's a very specific task, and you get nice and comfortable with it, and you know what you're going to be doing every day when you sit down, and there's fun to be had. It's also a slog, but you understand what that is. And then you've got to make this huge leap to a creative process where you're staring at a blank page and you have to tell a story. And I wanted to tell the story through the voices of the animals. And I came to that idea because I worked at the RSPCA for 5 years whilst I was researching the book. I was just doing a part-time job there. And so that made me think, oh, the animals should tell the story. It's best that they tell it. I did try telling it from a human perspective and it was a total disaster. But how did I write that voice? The answer is I don't really know. It happened inauspiciously, where, it would be a Wednesday afternoon, 2:00, just had a cup of tea, and all of a sudden I thought, oh, looks like I'm writing here. What's this? And the first sort of 10 pages of the book, they came out one afternoon, and they were hardly edited in the end. It was just this voice that was just suddenly there, and I don't really fully understand how that came through me. I mean, I don't know how you feel about your books, but sometimes you look back at a book you've written and you think, was that me? Did I do that? I don't really have any memory of doing that. I remember doing the research, but the actual writing, I guess I was there. I don't, if you asked me to remember those moments, I can't really. I don't know if it's just a creative brain thing or maybe I'm insane. I don't know. But when I'm in the moment of writing a story, I don't really know where I am at that time. I guess I'm physically sitting here at the desk, but mentally I'm somewhere else. And then I look back at the end of the day and think, oh well, there's some words appeared, and that seems okay. So yeah, it's a hard question for me to answer. Where did that voice come from? Because I don't really know.
I've got one follow-up question, and then there's a couple of questions coming through on the Q&A that I'm going to jump to. But you heard a voice, and you're not sure where the voice came from. Did the voice have a sound to it? Was there a tone and a timbre? Can you accord it with, I said at the beginning, this is almost reads like the script to a Pixar movie. Was there a particular actor who might have voiced the character of Mammoth in your head?
He did have a very specific voice. I think because I'd been researching a lot of dry, dusty men from the early 19th century, pompous sort of academic American gentlemen who were very full of themselves. He kind of spoke in that voice, and he had a very deep voice, quite laconic, quite arrogant and full of himself, and quite boring almost. And it's a bit of a strange thing as a writer to be sitting down and writing in the voice of a character who is meant to be boring. He bores the pants off everyone because he loves to talk and go over and over the same things again, which is why the other fossils were useful, because they can interrupt him and pull him up on things and ask, how could you possibly have known that? You weren't even there. And
so it's just like most men we know.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
So.
But the problem with having that voice in my head is that, I can put it down on the page, but then I haven't been doing a single reading from this book at all the events I've done, because I can't read in any of the voices. It just sounds stupid in my little Irish accent. I'm trying to read in the Mammoth's voice. So I've just been saying no to doing readings. And also when it came to doing the audiobook, I was like, well, there's no way I'm doing it. No way. And I said, we either have to hire a complete cast of actors or else hire one actor who can do amazing voices. And that's what they did. They found an actor who has done a lot of voices for Disney and Pixar movies, ironically. And when he sent me the samples of the character voices, I thought it was 4 different actors. I couldn't believe it was the same guy. So that's amazing. Rupert Degas is his name, and he's a hell of a talent. And the audiobook is a whole experience by itself. Yeah, I was able to listen to the audiobook and laugh and enjoy it, and it did not seem like anything that was related to what I had written, because it was performance. And I love that he performed the book. I'm an old, wannabe actor myself from back in the day. So I enjoyed his performance, and I hope when people read it, it is performed in their head.
I'm definitely going to get a hold of that, because I was planning to go back and read the book again. I'd enjoyed it so much, but now you've just put me on. I'm going to listen to the audio book. Now, Chris, I've got Alira here who has asked a terrific question, and which is, how did you navigate that complex combination of fact and fiction in the writing process? Because obviously they're very tightly interweaved in your narrative.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks, Alira. That is a tricky one. I've tried to describe the novel variously as, it's a novel, but it has a very strong nonfiction framework. It could have been a work of nonfiction, except I needed to go to some fictional places sometimes. So I've tried where I could to be as faithful to period and character and what people wore. I went into quite great detail of, the dress a woman might have worn in the year 1800. And that's a lot of fun, obviously, doing that. But so I've tried to give it as like an authenticity as much as I possibly could. But then, being a novel, I was then able to stretch the truth occasionally. As you know, the book is just jam-packed full of odd little facts, and most people have said when they're reading it, they're constantly going, I don't know, I'm going to check this, and then they pull out their phone and they and they check to see if something was real or not. Probably most of the really unlikely stuff in there is the truth, and some of the more banal things are the things that I've made up. One of the things that has sort of disappointed most people, I think, is the fact that one of my Irish characters, Kiva O'Neill, who people seem to love, she's not real. Someone I know said he spent 20 minutes on the internet trying to find out more about her before he realized I might have made her up. But she is very...
I have a question about her.
Right. She's very representative of women at that time, though, who were really fighting for agency and were heavily involved in the rebellion in Ireland.
Yeah, I rap that you've gone to Kiva, because I wanted to, that's the point, I must say, where I went to my phone, was to work out how to pronounce Kiva's name, because you've written it in Gaelic and it looks nothing like Kiva. And this is perhaps the aspect of the storyline that, if not autobiographical, is closest to your own story, because as perceptive listeners will have noticed, and you have said, you're Irish. And there's so much energy and alacrity to your telling of Kiva's story. She and Mammoth, to me, are the kind of dual heroes of this story. So I was wondering, where does Kiva's vivacity come from? Did this lift off the page from the archives, or did you grow up with women like Kiva? Is there something about Irish womanhood in her?
She reminds me very much of a couple of my cousins. I was the only boy in our family. It was all women. All my cousins were girls. I didn't have a single boy or man to talk to other than my dad, who was quite a reticent, reserved sort of fellow. I got on fine with him, but we never had much in common. And my uncles were all very, very quiet. So I just was, and I could not wait to go to my cousin's house all the time to actually have people to talk to who seemed to be similar to me. We had a bit of an odd, massive family in Ireland who none of us had very much money. None of us were very well educated, but there was a whole generation around about the same age as me who seemed to be just educating themselves and had a lot of agency and wanted to do something with their lives, and were very interested in history and politics and nature and travel. And so we were the first generation in our family to ever leave Ireland, myself and all of my cousins, the first people to ever go to university, the first ones to ever travel overseas. So I think there's a lot of my cousins, Sharon and Christine, probably in Kiva. And then I saw them echoed in the women of the Irish Rebellion in the early part of the 19th century, who did it pretty tough, but were pretty tough themselves, and were fighting for not just the freedom of their own country, but for their own personal freedoms. And as soon as and those sort of factors gelled together, and all of a sudden, here was Kiva, and she instantly became this great character who took on a huge life of her own, and I maybe she's. I'm always loath to say which character is the closest to me, but perhaps she's got some of me in her as well. I mean, I went to live in France. She goes over to France to try and raise funds for the rebellion. She ends up going to America, which I did too when I was younger. So perhaps Kiva has got a little bit of me in her.
Well, you mentioned Elizabeth Gilbert's idea of animus before, and so maybe Kiva's your anima. Chris, we're heading towards the pointy end of our session, so people, please do get your questions and answers, not your answers. Chris will take care of that. Get your questions lined up if you'd like to get on to him. The book really comes rollicking home. It has a huge drive towards the end. Without giving too much of the plot away, the final scenes on the American Western Plains act as a kind of a mirror to what occurred when the Neanderthal arrived on the steppe over 10,000 years earlier. I wondered whether you were trying to make a point about racism as much as about speciesism.
Yeah, racism is a very strong theme in the book. I mean, it starts off really with Moses Williams, who is one of the men who helped reassemble the bones of the mammoth after they unearthed it in New York in 1801. And it was put on display in Philadelphia, which is all true. And Moses worked for Rembrandt Peale, who was the portrait painter and amateur naturalist who put the bones on display for people.
So Moses is real. Moses is real.
Oh yes, he's real.
He's real. Yeah.
Yeah. Moses is real. He's sort of a bit of a forgotten character in history, but he is the first known African-American artist in that. And it's, talked about in the book. He not only did he help restore the mammoth skeleton, but he would restore lots of other exhibits in the museum. And made silhouette cuttings in the lobby of the museum, which were extremely popular, ended up being the most popular thing in the museum in Philadelphia. And he made his own money from that and established himself, and, you know, married and had a home and had children, and went on tour with the bones to France to try and explain to the French that, you know, America once had these leviathans as well. And in France is where he encounters Georges Cuvier and this original notion of scientific racism, which Cuvier is a very divisive figure in the scientific community, in that he was an early paleontologist who was the first person to coin the term dinosaur, to propose these ideas that the Earth was actually a lot older than people thought, that there was an age of reptiles that predated an age of man, which were all, you know, scandalous, heretical notions at that time. But he was on the money with a lot of that stuff. However, he did also propagate scientific racism and believed that mankind was split into 3 different races of people, with obviously the white people at the top and the people of color at the bottom. And that unfortunately endured in scientific thought for a very long time. And it didn't matter what evidence Moses presented to him, he didn't want to hear it. And so I did want to continue that throughout the book. And when Kiva, you know, ends up in the Western Plains of America and comes across the Osage Nation, who are slowly being eliminated by the advance of white fellas across the USA, and you know, she finds a bit of solace with them, and you know, but of course it's all going to end. It's all going to end badly. And I was very aware when writing about the Osage Nation that these are people that aren't around any longer, and I used some of their language in the book, but we got permission for that, and those sections of the book were read by the Native Languages of the Americas group, and to make sure that I was, you know, using the language correctly and portraying their culture in a sensitive way. And but I really enjoyed, you know, those interactions too. And so yeah, racism is definitely one of the ongoing themes in the book, that is yet another thing that humanity seems to be sticking with no matter what happens.
So that's depressing. And also, as you suggest, you know, things aren't going to end well. But one of the questions that we've got here that comes from Adele, she asks, what compels you to write a hopeful epilogue? And do you think the story of humans can have a happy ending? And I had almost an identical question to Adele's, and there's a little quote that I was going to read with it. So let me just do that. We have another chance now. We know what is required. We know what we're doing. So don't worry, my puny 2-legged friends. We'll take it from here. It's quite a, you know, for a book that's about extinction and human folly and arrogance and ignorance, it's a uplifting and almost sentimental ending. What takes you there?
I'm an optimist, and I'm that rare breed, a happy artist. I'm not someone who's tormented by my creative demons. I kind of
sorry, can I just say, an even rarer breed, a happy Irish artist.
Yes, that's right. I'm not some alcoholic misanthrope. Yeah. But yeah, so I really wanted to end on a positive note, because I have to believe that we will sort out our shit. That there are enough smart, intelligent, empathetic, you know, funny people in the world who will triumph over the forces of greed and ignorance and stupidity. It's very easy to be disheartened with modern life, because we have, you know, a constant interaction with depressing news and an unbelievable closeness to politics in our lives that we probably never had. We were never this close to politicians before. We listen to them every day now. We know what they're thinking. We know what they're talking. We're waiting to see what they say at press conferences. We're hanging on their every word as if they're celebrities. And so it's very easy to get sucked into that and not feel like anyone else exists in the world. But there's a lot of very, quiet people out there, very smart, who are working on, who are thinking about the problems that we face and trying to come up with solutions to them. And they don't get much of a shout probably. And I just wanted to have an epilogue that jumped forward in time to imagine the near future where we have looked to the past and actually learned from it for a change, and are correcting our mistakes in order to forge a better future for all of us, a more harmonious one that's where we're more in tune with nature and with each other. And maybe I'm just blindly optimistic, but I have to believe that that we will make it. That we're not so stupid that we're going to actually drive ourselves extinct.
And thank goodness for your optimism. It really, it is refreshing. And as people can see here, you talking now, and the way that you started it with it, this has been a passion project. It comes out of your intense personal interests and your drives, and that comes through it. This isn't colors by number kind of color by numbers kind of a book. You clearly haven't written it with a kind of commercial recipe for success, though you are achieving that audience, as you said, which is wonderful. And so sort of two-part question, one coming from the audience, and it ties in again with something that I was going to ask you. It seems to me that this book could be just as easily read by young adults and high school students as by adults. Maybe, the language might come with a language warning, but it really will have that appeal. And Danny's asked, have you considered talking to schools to inspire students who are like-minded, to encourage them to continue learning and write about what they're interested in? And I think that's the nub of this question, is about following your passion and see where it leads. So how do you feel about the impact that your work might have on young people?
Following your curiosity as well. I think if you've got an artistic, mien, if you feel like you're the sort of person who's got a creative heart and who is interested in the world, you have to follow your curiosity. And that doesn't necessarily mean looking inward. One of the amazing things for me as an artist is feeling like I have access to pretty much anything in the world through libraries. I've always had that sense since I was a child that I could access a world that was much larger than me. And we have that now, of course, with the internet as well. And so there are a million different subjects that I'm curious about. And one thing I would, encourage young people to do if they have, if they feel like they're creative, is to, blindly follow that curiosity, not really worry about, where it's taking you, whether it's the right thing to do, what purpose it serves. Sometimes it'll serve no purpose other than to just entertain you or educate you about something. But this is what it means to be a human being in the world. You have to be curious about the world that you live in, and you have to be willing to indulge that curiosity. Otherwise, what's the point? Interestingly, the book, I'd never really thought about younger people reading it. I've never really written anything for younger readers. And the first few interviews I did with journalists, they told me that their teenagers had picked up the book and were reading it. And one journalist, he said, my son, who never reads anything, he grabbed the book, read it, and then came running out of his room and sat down at his keyboard and started playing some music. And he said to him, what are you doing? He said, I've just read the scene where the glacier collapses and I wanted to compose some music to go with that scene. And that really, it really shocked me and sort of moved me quite a lot. I was on the phone and I was like, oh, that's almost, almost making me tear up there. That idea of you write a book and you don't know what the response is going to be to that book. You don't know if people are going to find something in the book that resonates with them, and to even inspire that one teenager to into a creative response of his own. My job's done. I'm happy now. You know, I don't care what happens to the book from this point on, because just that one moment alone, it's worth it. But repeatedly, I heard people say that their teenagers were picking up the book, and that is a bit of a unexpected surprise for me. But I'm glad that they are. I think it probably is accessible for teenagers. Yeah, there's a little bit of language in it, but it's not too bad. It's not like my first book that's filled with, you know, sex and swearing. So this one's a bit easier to access.
And it's nothing they don't see on Netflix every day.
No.
Chris, I think get used to that feeling of teenagers responding to the work, because my hot tip is that this is going to be on high school reading lists very shortly. We're going to have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Chris, for your generous and warm and responses tonight, and for the absolute pleasure also of your curiosity and everything that you have brought through it. Perhaps the next book won't take 6 years and we can access that a little quicker. Ordinarily at an event like this, I would now encourage the audience to go out into the foyer and purchase a copy of the book and have Chris sign it and ask any other questions that you might have. Of course, the nature of our times means that can't happen, but I am going to encourage you, as soon as you leave this webinar, to stay on your screens and Google up your local independent bookstore where you'll be able to order a copy of Chris's book, or you can go directly to the UQP website as well. Buy one for yourself, for your friend, and for all those teenagers that you know who may or may not like to read. I'm also wanting to thank the Geelong Regional Library Service for hosting this event with us tonight. Copies of Chris's book are available at the library, and there are also e-copies as well. If you've enjoyed tonight, check out some of the library's other offerings in its upcoming event series, and particularly Kate Grenville discussing her new book, A Room Made of Leaves, next Wednesday night. I interviewed Kate for the National Library last week, and I can guarantee you, you will not want to miss out on that conversation nor that book. It's really quite wonderful. So on behalf of the library, myself and Chris, thank you for joining us tonight, and goodbye.
Thanks, Claire.
Thanks.